What cognitive load is, it's really a term that we use to describe how much capacity, how much space does a brain have available to not just hear and remember, but also use information. Struggle forces or reinforces students to think, this is hard, I can't, I don't want to. And so struggle is not productive. But gradually removing the supports when the child is ready is productive. A huge way that parents can help is by making sure that you're lightening the load for them.
I have Dr. Jamie Peavler with us today to talk about something that's so important, cognitive load. So, Jamie, can you please introduce yourselves for our parent listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work?
Sure. So yes, my name's Jamie Peavler, and I think probably the most important thing to lead with is I'm a classroom teacher. So I taught in Indianapolis Public Schools for 20 years. And in that time, it was definitely trial by fire. I realized that my teacher preparation program did not set me up to know what to do, with typical learners as they're acquiring reading and written expression skills, let alone students who needed more attention and support from me. I was completely lost of what to do. So fairly early on in my career, I actually reached out and connected with the International Dyslexia Association, our Indiana chapter. And that's where I really started to expand my knowledge on dyslexia and Orton-Gillingham. And that led me to work for a nonprofit in Indiana where we train teachers across the state in Indiana and the Orton-Gillingham approach. And then that led me to Mount St. Joseph University, where I teach in the graduate and doctoral reading science programs now. So that's a lot of what I'm currently doing. My husband is a fifth grade educator. We have 3 children, and our children have not experienced a lot of those challenges. So, because we're not having to focus on our own children, my husband and I are both very committed on helping families who are experiencing those challenges.
Well, we appreciate that so much, especially coming from my daughter has dyslexia and was in the public school system. And I did feel like they didn't totally understand what to do to help her, and even with the best of intentions. We are going to talk about something that's, I feel, a hugely missing piece when you're trying to learn about helping your child with dyslexia. As a parent, you can read everything about the science of reading. There's tons about phonemic awareness, systematic, multisensory, cumulative, explicit phonics, all of that. But there's this thread through it all that I feel like is not always, either it's missing or it's not clear to a parent trying to consume this information. And that is the piece about the cognitive load on the learner, especially dyslexic learners. And so for our listeners, I went to Jamie's wonderful presentation at the International Dyslexia Association DyslexiaCon in Atlanta. There was like a light bulb moment for me to understand the missing piece on why my daughter sometimes didn't remember things that I thought she got like a week earlier. And so I'm really excited to talk about this. So can you explain maybe to our parent listeners, like, what is cognitive load to begin with?
Yes. Well, and it's not surprising that you're not seeing it talked about or hearing it talked about, because even in teacher preparation programs, we're not talking about it. But what cognitive load is, it's really a term that we use to describe how much capacity, how much space does a brain have available to not just hear and remember, but also use information. And so I think maybe if we start with a real life example, it will be easier to look at what it's like from a learning process. But cognitive load, again, think about managing, juggling. So when I'm at home, often in the evenings, busy after a day of thinking about things, I find myself in situations where my family taxes my cognitive load. For instance, if I'm in the middle of cooking something and I am not a great cook, so I'm very dependent on a recipe. If I'm in the middle of following a recipe and my son walks in and says, "Hey, Mom, where are my compression shorts for marching band?" And I have to think about where they are and tell him, or leave the kitchen to help him find them. When I come back, I have no idea which step I left off of in the recipe. And I'm at a loss for, do I go ahead and add more salt and risk it being salty? Or what do you do? So cognitive load is your ability to maintain and think about and process information. And it is important to understand for learning, for functioning, for carrying on conversations and remembering what you're going to say next. We just take it for granted and we definitely don't talk about it enough.
That's a great example. I love that because every parent knows what that feels like when you're in the middle of something and your kid asks you where something is. And so, something that you talked a lot about in your presentation was like this funnel of getting the information into the child at the right pace. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, actually, I remember the first time hearing Eric Treatise talk about executive functioning. He talked about our brain being like a cup. And, if we're pouring information in, eventually we're going to pour it in at such an incredible rate that there's going to be an overflow effect and things will fall out. But what I've come to understand is that it goes a step further. It's not really that our brain is a cup, it's more like it's a funnel because there is this process of moving information out of working memory into what we just know, our long-term memory. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment, but it's this funnel of keeping up with the rate of information coming in. So we know that there are different types and sizes of funnels. So a funnel that might have a wider opening, we can pour more in very quickly and we're not going to overflow it. But if that funnel has a narrow opening, which is very much the case for students who are experiencing difficulty learning a concept, then we might risk that we're pouring information in at a faster rate than that learner can manage. And so information is overflowing and it's falling out. And that does look like students not remembering something that they understood just a few moments ago.
Right. And I think something that you said in your presentation, or maybe it was a note I wrote down, like I wrote down exposure does not equal learning. It's just not the same thing. And that really helped me understand why my daughter would be exposed to something in class, and maybe be able to even remember it for a day or a week or something, but then it's totally gone. I would think about, especially like spelling lists, the weekly spelling lists. She always did great on her weekly spelling list, but then none of that was transferring in. So that
And
that
it's
was
neat
really
that
helpful.
you made that connection because that's exactly it. Exposure is the pouring in, but access is how well that information stayed in. In your spelling test example, I think we've all even experienced ourselves as students, but we definitely are seeing it with our own children, that when you rehearse something over and over again, you might know it for a short period of time. That's what we call in research the priming effect. And so it's, you pull it up quickly because you've just been working on it. But the real test is it still there over time? And, as more content is being exposed and poured in, it's very possible that what we knew last week was the same thing that came out that was lost in the overflow.
That makes so much sense. So, how can you talk about the different types of memory? There's short term, long term, and working memory. And so it sounds like the information is going into the working memory. And then with rehearsal, eventually gets to the long term memory. I think that's oversimplified, but can you explain that a little bit
That's
better?
a really good start. So, thinking about that funnel again for a moment, the way learning works is, the learner is taking in new information. And sometimes that new information is actually familiar. It's not necessarily new, but it might be presented in a new way. And so, the learner's taking in information that's presented visually. Sometimes the teacher is modeling something on a screen. It could be provided orally as a direction or a description, but regardless of how it's presented, the learner is taking all this new information in. If it genuinely is new, it's information in your short-term memory. And short-term memory is temporary. When you think about memory tests, so students who've gone through formal evaluations often have tests that have digit span or working memory measures. And really what that's looking at is, how much information in short-term memory can, kind of be managed in working memory. So again, short-term, think of ingredients. Those are the ingredients for the lesson. Working memory is the process of putting that, like recipe together. It's, holding on to and connecting and trying to make these systems work. Long-term memory is permanent memory, and it contains information that you couldn't forget if you tried. And so you may remember in the presentation, we did a little exercise around what random things are stored in our long-term memory, like song lyrics, math facts, hopefully eventually are stored in there. And for an individual with dyslexia, we really hope phoneme grapheme correspondences or phonics skills are stored in there. But long term memory contains ingredients that are always available to the learner. And you can pull them out right away. They are staples and they're going to be used. And so, knowing how those memory systems work is essential because we may have a false sense of security when students appear to know something. They may know it because their working memory is allowing them to show us that they understand, but that's not a guarantee that that same skill has reached long-term memory where it's permanent. And so that's why it's important to know the difference between working memory, the kind of doing now in the moment, and long-term memory, which is permanence.
In one thing I want to touch on with working memory, a lot of parents who have had a evaluation for their child may have seen low working memory, especially with dyslexia. So, and parents are also just so desperate to help their child. You go online, you might read something like, "Oh, this is gonna increase your child's working memory." Can I fact check that with you? Can you adjust the working memory levels that, you're kind of born with or given?
There is no way to independently improve your working memory. So there's no evidence that has been able to withhold or withstand peer review and criticism to confidently say doing this exercise or doing this, cross midline activity increases working memory. The only thing that improves the efficiency, so we can improve the efficiency of our working memory, we can't increase it, we can't strengthen it, but we can make it more efficient when the information we ask the learner to think about is in the long-term memory. Because what taxes and makes the working memory look slow, and that's the red flag that a lot of parents have seen in reports, is slow processing. Well,
Mhm.
what's causing that working memory to slowly process information is the demand that it's placing on the learner to remember so many things. And when that's happening, it's because the things the individual has to remember are short-term temporary ingredients, not long-term ones. So the only way to, again, make the working memory system more efficient is to increase the amount of valuable information that students have permanently stored in their long-term memory, because long-term memory information gets pulled up instantly. It doesn't tax the memory of having to hold on to it and rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it so we don't forget it. It's there on demand. So spending time or even financial resources in programs or in interventions designed to work on working memory, especially in isolation, are not effective. The only way we can improve that is to overlearn the content that is taxing a student's working memory to begin with.
Thank you for clearing that up because I think a lot of parents want the answer to be that there's something they can do about it. But the truth is there is, like you're saying, it's overlearning the content. And I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's like if all of this information is new, it's not in the long-term memory yet. You're just juggling all of these balls. But if some of those balls are, I don't know, in your pocket, it's less to juggle. You can just grab it really quickly or it's kind of like that. That's what I'm picturing when you're explaining it that way. And it's a matter of like putting those balls, getting as many balls in their pocket so they're not juggling maybe as many. Is it kind of like that?
It is. And it's interesting because I think about other fields that understand this and how it works. So if your child plays sports, their coach is going to make sure that they have overlearned all the essential skills that they need to play the game or to do the sport well. That's why they do drills all the time, because you don't want a student when they're getting a basketball passed to them to have to think about, wait, what do I do with this when it comes to me? It should be a muscle memory, like immediate response. And then same thing with, arts and performances. You overlearn a piece so that you can play it well. But in education, especially in the last 30 years, we have this negative connotation of drill and overlearning. And we have associated that with really low expectations and very, low level skills and not producing innovative thinkers. we have started to value this idea of discovery, and we need to have kids do higher level thinking and higher level processes. But that would be like a coach saying, I don't need you to get these drills down and these skills down. Let's just go out and play the game in a very discovery based way and let's figure out our moves. That would not fly. Would that fly? And, in music, you have to know how to play your instrument. You have to know how it works. And so when it comes to literacy skills, even math skills, but sticking with literacy today, with literacy skills, you can't expect a student to apply if they have not overlearned the essential pieces of what reading and writing requires of them.
That makes so much sense. And I can give an example about a really basic example like the floss rule, where you double the F, L, S, and Z at the end of a short word with a short vowel. And that is something where my child has been learning it over and over again, but then forgets it and then relearns it and then seems to forget it. And then I want to ask you about this idea of interference, because at some point she was getting like the double, let's say the double F, but then she's spelling a word like drift and then adds the two Fs, or the words that end in CK versus NK. This idea where she finally overlearned something, or like the R control pattern, like AR, but then when she's spelling shrimp, which is a blend, she's adding the AR in the blend. So can you help me understand what's going on there? Because I think it seems confusing as a parent. I get it now, the overlearning, but then it seems to sometimes interfere with new learning. What's going on there?
Right. So there is a little bit of overlearning and a little bit of overgeneralization that look the same. So when a child takes a concept like FF and they misapply it, like in the word drift that you gave an example, that's really what we would identify as overgeneralization. So they're assuming that all words that have that sound at the end will have a double F. Even though you've already seen evidence that she knows the rule, she has not really gotten to generalization. She jumped to overgeneralization. And so overgeneralization often occurs just the way that you described. And those are all very familiar examples with my work with students, very common. Overgeneralization tends to happen when we skip the step of comparing and contrasting. And so when I think about, the times that I've taught the floss rule, after students have mastered that, and to me, mastery is they're accurate, they're automatic, and they're applying it in a controlled setting. So I'm going to avoid for a while introducing things to them that could be close enough that it creates confusion. So I'm going to tightly control the practice. I don't want to throw any curveballs at them. And then when I see that they're doing it with ease and they're not struggling to apply it, errors are very, very low, then I can start to introduce contrasting words. So if she's spelling words like cuff and stuff and off correctly, then I'm going to pull cliff in or draft in or drift in. And I'm going to show why that F isn't doubled. And I'm going to be really explicit about that. And then I'm just going to go back and forth between words that do have a double F and words that don't, and why. And once she's accurate in applying that, then I'm looking for, but is she automatic, or is she still having to kind of work through and I can see the wheels turning? Because if she's still having the wheels turn, we're going to stay there a little bit longer. Once it seems to be accurate and automatic, then I'm going to promote that into kind of a little bit of a break before we see it again, and making sure that she's getting closer to applying it in a less controlled setting. So sometimes what you see there is more that we got them accurate and automatic, and then we just moved on. We didn't provide that compare and contrast.
That makes so much sense. And I think that explicitly explaining the difference part is really important as well. I want to give you another example, which is that my daughter, when she was in second grade, she had a Norton Gillingham tutor. Things were going great. She was making a lot of progress. And I made the huge mistake, which I'll never forgive myself for. But as a parent, you're always trying to balance having your child with dyslexia get the help they need, but also get the rest and play that they need. And so I said, let's give her the summer off, let's give her a break. And she came back in the fall with the tutor, and it was like it was all gone. It was like just all gone. You see them getting it accurate. Accuracy and automaticity are not the same thing. And that's something you helped me understand in your presentation. And then another piece to that is that when I'm trying to help my daughter, I had this wrong thinking that if she was getting it right all the time, we were wasting time. When your child is 8, 9, 10, and a couple grade levels behind, there's this sense of urgency, that you want to get them ahead. But it's actually the counterintuitive idea that works, and that is that repetition, even after they're accurate. So, can you in your better terms than mine explain the difference between accuracy and automaticity?
That's good. I like how you framed that too. And I think, as a parent, not having to worry about summer loss and taking time off, I have so many things I can't forgive myself for. When I thought things were okay and I stopped monitoring and I let my guard down only to discover it wasn't as okay as I thought. So what you described in your experience really gets to this idea of stages of proficiency, or what we would call the instructional hierarchy. And so when we think about an objective way of knowing how well a student actually knows a skill and doesn't know a skill makes it easier for us to decide, can we step back and monitor this less, or do we still need to work on it? And so, when a child is able to perform a skill accurately, all that means is they now have connected the dots. And the learning process has really just begun. And so I think the tendency to step away and go, okay, they have it, we don't need to work on it anymore, that's miscommunicated to teachers too. We were told the same thing. We were told that once a child understands, your work is done, move on. Now, as a parent, of course, that's probably going to feel magnified as a message because, like you said, you're seeing the mountain that you have to get to. And if you feel like it's taking a long time to get there, and staying and working on a skill for a long time is making it look like that time frame is going to take forever, then we do tend to want to push ourselves. But when accuracy is high, and when I say high accuracy, really, it should be 95% or higher. And so once that accuracy is there, now I'm looking for automaticity. And what automaticity looks like is immediate response. So in the accuracy stage, you might see that the child isn't making mistakes, but it's effortful. They might need you to prompt them. They might need you to point. They might need to give a verbal reminder, like, what is the E doing at the end of that word? Or you might see them looking up in their own brain and kind of connecting the dots. That's not automatic. Automatic is an instant response. And so when they are accurate and automatic, now they're ready to apply that skill. But until you see that automaticity, asking a child to apply a skill to read a passage, write a sentence, is a little risky, because what's happening is we will tax their working memory. And when we go back to that funnel and we're thinking about taxing working memory, we're risking that the effort that it took them to apply that was so great that they're not actually going to remember it well. What's going to happen is they're going to forget something they used to know because all their concentration and focus is on that challenging thing. So really, once they become accurate, our work isn't done yet either. Our work becomes supporting application. And so when we see that they're able to, again, apply it in reading and writing, then our goal is, okay, but let's not let them forget it. And the way we ensure that kids don't forget is going to also sound counterintuitive. It is taking a break for a day or two and then bringing it back. And if after that short break, they are still accurate, automatic, and able to apply, great. We're going to take a little bit longer break. Extend that break by a couple days before we incorporate it back into the lesson. So the goal is to gradually increase periods of rest, because that rest is the way that you will confirm it really made it into long-term memory.
So that spaced retrieval, I think, is a term I've heard of. It's actually going out and getting it and retrieving that information is what's strengthening that connection. Is that accurate?
It is. It's very much like, if you go to the gym and lift weights and you've had a couple of days of rest, you're going to get more out of lifting that weight than if you did the same thing every day. So it's strengthening that connection by having them work a little bit harder. But if you see that, taking that break causes them to not be as automatic, or you see more errors, then we can't have those breaks. We got to go back to reviewing it and kind of firming it up a little bit. So as long as they're still accurate, automatic, and generalizing, we're getting something effective out of that break and that effort. And before I forget, one term, as you were describing that kind of need to move them and challenge them a little bit, educators are hearing that a lot, and they're hearing it labeled as productive struggle. And the term productive struggle, which is a big buzzword in education right now, is actually very concerning. So, in the cognitive psychology perspective or community, we know that struggle is actually not productive because struggle forces or reinforces students to think, this is hard, I can't, I don't want to. And so, struggle is not productive. But scaffolding and gradually removing the supports when the child is ready is productive. So we should not see struggle when we are gradually removing those scaffolds.
I mean, I think parents often forget how hard it is to learn how to read, and or if you don't have dyslexia, you truly don't understand. That is something that I did feel like I learned the hard way, is this idea of trying to give her something that was a little bit harder or a little close to her grade level, and thinking that that would work. But I understand much better now, and so I agree with you. I That does sound concerning, that idea of struggle. I think what maybe you could do as a parent, and tell me what you think of this, is read to your child a book that's closer to their grade level for the exposure to the vocabulary, or you know exposure to different ideas and things, but not force them to try to do something that they're just really struggling through.
That's a really good example, especially when you have a child that's really having difficulty with phonics and word recognition skills. A consequence of that is that they often don't have the opportunity to engage with text that is at their listening comprehension level, that does have the vocabulary that they need to learn, and the topic and the background knowledge that they need to acquire, and the complex sentences that they need to hear. So you can reduce the cognitive load that they're feeling and not tax their memory system if you're reading to them that text. And as you're reading to them, I know sometimes it feels weird to, interrupt the read, because we probably as children, we're used to having a story read to us beginning to end, and then we would talk about it afterwards. But for a child who is really having language difficulty, it's important that we pause and frequently check to see, what just happened there, or what do you think about the choice the character made? So frequent checks for understanding, maybe even before you're reading out loud, pre-teaching a vocabulary word, so that when that word comes up in the story, they have enough of an understanding to get the gist of the meaning. And then after that word is encountered, you can follow up and check. But a huge way that parents can help is by making sure that you're lightening the load for them so that they can benefit from the instruction. And I am sure you and many parents who are listening have been told many times by educators, just read to your child, and that somehow that would fix everything. It doesn't fix everything, but oh my gosh, it's going to help tremendously if it's done in a way that gives your child access to really good text and doesn't frustrate them by having them read it on their own.
Yeah, that's perfect. So, let's talk more about the types of load. So, something you talked about in your presentation was this difference between intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. Can you explain those different types of load, and then maybe an example of what that would look like at home at the kitchen table trying to practice reading or homework or things like that?
Yes. So all three of those load types, take up the space in the funnel. And so the type of load that we want to give the most space for is germane load. That's that productive learning. So your brain is working hard when it makes a connection, when it goes, oh, that's what this means, or oh, CH and CK are not the same. Like that takes up space, and that's good productive learning. So I often associate that with germinate, grow. So we want a lot of space available. The problem is the other two types, intrinsic and extraneous, they get first dibs on space in that funnel. And so if they take up space, then there's less space for productive learning to occur. So, what we want to do is keep those really low and manageable. So, that means we have to understand what causes them. Intrinsic load is caused when a child doesn't have the skills they need for the lesson. That's why exposure is a concern. And so, when a child is sitting in a classroom being exposed to content that doesn't make sense to him or her because it's way beyond their current performance level, then their intrinsic load is going to consume all of that space in the funnel, and so very little learning will occur. An example of that might be, let's say you have a second grade child whose classroom is teaching a phonics lesson on multisyllabic words. And so the teacher might be helping students to identify the vowels in the word and then divide it and then apply syllable types. But if the child is still having difficulty recognizing which letters are vowel letters and which letters are consonant letters, they're probably going to make errors in that very first step. Or they're going to be delayed behind the rest of the class to even understand what's happening. If the child doesn't understand syllable types well enough to decode them, that's also going to set them up for, not having the same success. So intrinsic load is caused when the child is not matched for the lesson, does not have the prerequisite skills, and is really slowly retrieving the information that the lesson assumes the child already has. And so what worries me, especially for children with dyslexia, is this is the bulk of what their day is like in reading or in writing. They might be sitting through a lesson that's a grade level phonics lesson that is over their head, and they just didn't get anything from it. And so, then later in the day, when they do get their just right phonics lesson, their brain is at capacity and they're not going to get as much out of it. So that's intrinsic load. We can reduce that by using an access, not an exposure model. And so that would look like a walk to read, where students went to their just right phonics lesson and got the just right phonics lesson for them. Extraneous load is caused by lesson design. And so a lot of our instructional materials that get credit for being well developed still have some concerns with their lesson routines and procedures. So extraneous load, if we stick with lesson routines and procedures for a moment, that's increased when there are too many steps. So I'm going to go back to that syllable division example. When a child has to underline the vowels and label them B and label the consonants between them C and then divide and then code the syllable and then swoop, that's a lot of steps. And so when there are too many steps to remember, then often the student leaves one out, we have errors, or their brain is just thinking about what are the steps, and they can't think about the content. So the way that we would reduce extraneous load is by improving instructional design. We could talk a little bit more about that too. But another common cause of extraneous load that we might not realize is happening is environmental distractors. So a lot of our students who have dyslexia or another, documented disability, they're getting extra support in a push-in model. And a push-in model has multiple adults in the classroom. Well, if I have a language-based disability and I am trying to pay attention to what the teacher is saying, but there is another adult in the room talking and giving some additional feedback, I have what we call split attention effect, and I'm not really sure who to listen to and what to pay attention to and what to kind of tune out. That causes extraneous load to be high, as well as, other environmental things like a busy classroom is outside of the classroom. Maybe I'm sitting next to someone who taps their pencil. Like there's a lot of things that could increase extraneous load. And so we first need to reduce it by eliminating as many of those environmental distractors as we can. This is why sometimes pulling kids out of that noisy environment and putting them in, an area that they can concentrate better is important. You're not preventing them from having access to grade level content, you're protecting the attention that they need to be able to have to the lesson. And in addition to environmental distractors, we think about lesson design. We'll talk a little bit about part to whole. That's going to be one way to help kids be more successful. But another one is just being really consistent in our routines and procedures. Because if every day the lesson works the same way, I don't need the teacher to give me directions. I know what to do, and I can focus my attention on learning the content. If we're all using the same language, if my classroom teacher's calling it Magic-y and my interventionist is also calling it Magic-y, that's great, but that's not happening. We have one teacher saying magic E, another one saying silent E, another one saying bossy E or sneaky E, and I really don't have any idea that you're all talking about the same thing. So, consistency of lesson routines, consistency of language, removing distractors, being really scaffolded in part to whole, those are the best ways to reduce extraneous load. Because remember, it's those two types of load that will take up the learning space that we need for germane.
I can totally relate to that in the sense of, when my husband starts talking about he's really into audio equipment. And when he starts talking, I have no idea what he's talking about. I have had to learn over the years, but nothing is, I'm not taking in anything. I don't know what he's talking about, and I know music. That doesn't mean I know all of the terms that he's talking about when he's talking about audio equipment. So
Right.
I think that's really interesting. I'm curious, can your thoughts be some type of extraneous load? Because sometimes when I'm just doing like a few spelling, repetitions with my daughter, she'll write a word and then she'll talk about something totally unrelated, like what we're doing on Friday. And then she'll write a word and then she'll talk about, something the dog did. Is I guess can internal thoughts kind of be considered one of those types of loads that's interfering?
Absolutely. So extraneous load can really be, synthesized down to your attention to the task, your ability to attend to the task. So sometimes it is caused internally. And then, of course, thinking about that, the overlap between students who have dyslexia and ADD or ADHD, that's actually pretty common. What we don't know is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because often, if something is hard, your brain will naturally step away from that task. It's a way of kind of making more space in your brain. And so is she stepping away because intrinsic load is high and that's a way of compensating? Or is this thought there and it's interfering with attention and it's actually causing the load? We don't know. And that could vary by situation. It could vary by individual. But one thing to think about as a strategy is if you see that that's happening a lot, the strategy would be what's causing it. And if it is an intrinsic cause because the skills are not there, then that's our thing to remediate and address. If it's not that and it's an environmental or a situational thing, then that's the thing to address. And sometimes situational is something happened in my environment that triggered. So maybe the dog barked. And so now I'm thinking about the dog. Maybe the word I wrote maybe connect to this activity that we're doing this weekend. So those are going to be harder to manage, but really kind of being attuned to, is it caused by an intrinsic variable or was it caused by an environmental variable?
Okay, so for parents, the intrinsic is sort of the intrinsic and extraneous are the things that they get first dibs. And that is the intrinsic is the hard kind of stuff. The extraneous load is like the confusing distractions, other person talking. And the germane load is the actual learning, thinking about what you're learning. Maybe things are working around in their working memory. You have a chance to kind of process it. Is that
That's
right?
perfect. So think intrinsic, kernel. Those are what skills am I bringing to the table to be successful?
Okay,
And extraneous is more outside of me. What are all the extra demands on my attention? Is it
I
the lesson
see.
itself? Is it environmental? So internal, intrinsic skills, external, extraneous, environmental.
Okay, that makes sense. So I have a question about from a parent's perspective. I try to make it fun for my child but I'm also highly aware learning all of this that games or, making something silly or whatever might make her start thinking of something else and she's not getting that, germane productive learning. So how would you recommend as a parent to sort of balance creating that fun environment, fun learning environment for their child for, let's say, practicing. Something we do at home is sound boxes. Like you pull down the magnets and you write the different graphemes for the different sounds, or just playing like a bingo, a reading game, or things like that. How do you recommend sort of balancing all of these types of extra load with making the learning fun in a parent role?
Oh, that's good. So, for the most part, you have to think about managing if it's a skill that's fairly new, that's going to have a high intrinsic load capacity on the kids. They're going to really be focused on that. That means we don't really want to gamify that part. We just want to give the practice and the reinforcement. So we would want to keep it simple. Most of the time, when it comes to parents providing practice, I give the advice of maintenance. So if the parent can help maintain the skills that we don't want the student to forget, that will help the teacher support generalization better. So what that looks like to me is that's where games can become kind of a fun maintenance activity. I might use games, which is high extraneous load because you have directions you have to think about, kind of how do we play this and whose turn is it? That's high extraneous load. That's really environmental outside of the learner. Those activities are better suited for skills that the child is already accurate and automatic with. And so by doing that, they should be able to quickly respond. So the bingo activity is a great one. So let's think about, with bingo, it could be that across the board, just as an example, let's pretend you have been working on R controlled vowels with your child. It might be that in the B column are all the AR words, and in the, I column are all the OR words, and then the other columns maybe are a mixed. But it just depends on if that skill is pretty solid, then they can put it in a game-like situation. But if that's a fairly new skill, R controlled vowel, I wouldn't do it in a game-like situation. I would do it, in a word list reading where they can just think about the skill and not the task itself.
That makes so much sense based on everything else you've explained. So I like that. And so another thing that I worry is some type of, see, I'm even struggling to learn the intrinsic and extraneous load. Now I understand why.
It
It's
only took
because
me a year.
the terms are not really solid in my long-term memory yet. So when I think about visuals, because I read this other book about maybe visuals are not helpful because they're distracting. But I find that hard to believe because when I saw your presentation and you had lots of great visuals in your presentation. And I am a visual learner. And I think a lot of kids with dyslexia, at least my daughter, can absorb visual information so fast. How do we balance not creating distractions, but using visuals to possibly support? Can you kinda help me understand that or help our listeners
Yes.
understand that?
So that's a really good question that I feel like curriculum developers and instructional design people need to do more homework and research. And because what we know, there's an effect in cognitive load theory called the split attention effect. It's not a good thing. It's when you're asking a learner to process two different pieces of information at the same time. So I think when people say visuals are distracting, they're actually talking about the split attention effect. But it doesn't have to be that way. A visual could actually explain in a more succinct way something that's very difficult to explain orally. And so it's not a matter of should I or shouldn't I, it's a matter of what is the best choice at this time. So, for example, one of the visuals you might be referring to was the actual funnel that showed, how intrinsic load and extraneous load were stacking up. So, really, we think back to how that was presented. What was presented first was your working memory is like a funnel. And we talked about the rate of information in and information out. And so, to be able to look at a familiar visual like a funnel, and I know how a funnel works, that wasn't competing with the oral information because the funnel itself is familiar. What's unfamiliar is the context of why are we talking about a funnel? And so once that was established, then I could introduce an important piece of information like, well, what takes up this funnel space is intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane. And we could talk about one at a time. So visuals and verbal information should work together. They shouldn't pull your attention apart. And so a lot of curriculum, unfortunately, is designed such that there is a split attention effect, and students have to look at something and listen, and both are new. Both should not be new. If you're using visual and verbal, one should be familiar so that you can process the new one. And if you're unsure as a parent and something's coming home, I just would stagger it. So I might show something visually and I just give them time to take it in visually, and then I explain the visual. So a quick fix is just don't do it simultaneously, kind of have a pause in between.
And on a really basic example, I think about how as my child is going through the phonics skills, there can be really simple words that she doesn't know the meaning of. And I've understood now how important it is to know the meaning so that you can map that in your mind and recognize those words faster in the future. And so I'm thinking of like the word shrill. That's a very almost first grade word. But if you've never like heard that word, and you don't know what it means, taking the time to like show maybe a picture of like a whistle or a sound or something. ha- I think parents have a great opportunity to do that because I don't know how a teacher with a bunch of kids could check on understanding every single word. So, how could a parent sort of fill in those meaning gaps with visuals? I'm trying to kind of map that to what you said. If they've never heard the word and they're also struggling to read the word and they also don't know what it means, what's the process for that? I know that's really basic, but it's important.
It's so relevant because it's going to be a common reoccurrence for kids. One of the things I have my husband do with his students, which is hard to do in a classroom of 28, easier to do one-on-one at home, is if we are going to read a passage together, especially if the student is really kind of at a more foundational level of decoding and it's taking a little bit of time, I might have them just skim on their own, not read out loud for me, but skim the first paragraph or the first several sentences. And I ask them to underline any words that they're skimming that they're not sure about. And it could be they're not sure about for sounding it out, or they're not sure about it because they don't really know that word and they don't know what it means. And so then before we read together, I actually address the words that they underlined. So let's say they did underline shrill, then I might describe, or I might mimic, or I might go to my phone and type something in and show them so that when we do read, that's not interfering with their ability to decode or their ability to understand what they're reading. So
Okay.
that's where that kind of pre-teaching comes into play. And again, a parent is in a wonderful position to be able to do that because it's just one individual, whereas in a classroom, we all have different vocabulary. So I think that's one of the reasons why the teachers don't always address it as intentionally. So let them skim, pre-teach any words they don't know, or if you pretty much know, so I think about a Spire passage that I often use with kids. They don't know what a skiff is. So before we read, I just pull up, I didn't know what a skiff was. I'm landlocked. So I would pull up
Yeah.
a skiff and show them, this is what a skiff is. We're going to be reading about this. Or if the word glum is in, and I'm pretty sure most of my kids don't know glum, I'm going to say glum is another word for sad. So when my ice cream fell off my cone, how did I feel? And they would say glum. Okay. And now we can read the passage.
And when you were giving that example, you mentioned something I wanted to ask you about, and that's connecting to something you already know. It seems to me that I don't know if I've read this directly, but it's a hypothesis that do kids with dyslexia need more connections to something that they already know? I mean, it seems like everybody benefits if you can relate some new information to something they already know, but it just seems to me like maybe kids with dyslexia need that even more or need more connections.
Yes. So learning for all people is expedited and more efficient when we can connect new knowledge to prior knowledge. And so I think for individuals with dyslexia, because language is the concern, it's not just about decoding the word. Sometimes it's about the usage and what the word means. And so supporting them in decoding by leveraging anything that we can connect that word to, whether it's a meaning, a synonym of another word, is a win-win. Those connections in a scientific journal would be called schema. So anytime, we can build schema around something, it makes learning more permanent. So schema is this idea that my brain craves organization. And if I can take what I'm teaching you and connect it to something that's already in your long-term memory, it increases the chance that you're going to organize that and retrieve it in the future. But what I worry about is sometimes materials go way too far in the extreme of connecting too much. So if a child already knows what a word means and we're working on decoding it, our job is done. We don't have to talk about vocabulary of that word. And so a lesson that I saw recently that worried me is they were decoding short E words and they had web and read and they were doing vocabulary and morphology and phonology of all of those words. Well, phonology had been warmed up and it was really good. So we didn't need to do it as we were decoding all the words. And most of the kids in the classroom knew what all those words meant, so we didn't need to do vocabulary. That word list was to practice decoding. And so I think we again just have to be mindful about what's the focus of what we're doing. And is that actually evident in our routines and procedures? Or are we trying to do too much with those words and working against ourselves?
So for parents, what are some like red flags that either they're noticing at home or that they're in a parent teacher conference and maybe the teacher's saying that your child is, not listening or spaced out, or how do they kind of figure out when, I don't know, to sort of dissect what's going on with the cognitive load?
Yeah, there are two very common responses that students will demonstrate when they are cognitively overloaded. The first one is they check out. So, when your brain is taxed and you are overwhelmed, there's not a whole lot you can do. It's just innate in us to free up space, distract ourselves. So, that might look like a child putting his or her head down. It might look like daydreaming. It might even look like pencil tapping. So sometimes it's a quiet disengagement and they look like they've just kind of glazed over, but they're still with us. Sometimes it's not so quiet. Sometimes it could be disengagement that is a little disruptive to the classroom. But disengagement is a huge red flag of cognitive overload. Another one is acting out. So when a child is not able to regulate how frustrated they are, they might act out. They might say something that they wouldn't otherwise say. They might do something, slam a pencil down, throw something off the table. So checking out and acting out are two red flags for cognitive load. And so that might be talked about in a conference with a teacher as your child does not try hard enough. They're not motivated. They're not listening. They're misbehaving, and their misbehaving is causing them to not get anything out of the lesson. That's typically not how it works. Misbehavior and disengagement usually isn't causing the problem. The academic needs not being met, that's usually causing the disengagement and the acting out.
Yeah, which is so unfair and frustrating to hear for the child. So, thank you so much, Jamie, for all of your insight. Just to kind of wrap up, I guess, what are things parents can do at home? You talked a little bit about this, but if parents are already reading to their child and they want to carve out maybe 20 minutes a day to just help their child either get that information into the long-term memory or be better prepared for the next day at school in those elementary years when they're really just trying to learn how to read. What's maybe a takeaway that you would recommend?
I would really focus on maintaining skills that they have explicitly learned. I think we want to stay away from practicing what was just taught new, and that's tempting. I think, something was just learned, like our controlled or vowel teams, and that's what we want to focus on supporting. But actually, it's going to help a student in the long term better at home if we're working on not letting them forget what they worked so hard to learn. And again, those are the things that should be a little easier, which is a win because when they come home, we really do need to lighten the load for them and let them be kids. And they've worked very hard at school. A lot of our kids with dyslexia have worked 10 times harder than the traditional learners have, and they are tired and they've earned that break. But at the same time, like your summer, kind of break from tutoring causes angst. We don't want them to forget what they worked so hard to learn. So I would work on, if you feel comfortable doing another visual drill with content they know, that's a win because those are the ingredients that we want to overlearn. If you feel comfortable doing a blending drill with them, great. But sometimes a blending drill puts non-words out there, and you as a adult might not feel very confident about whether that was read correctly or not. So go ahead and do real words. But what I would work on is making sure you're practicing maintaining old content that comes easy for the child, because that's also going to remove the stress and the angst of that tutor student relationship. You still want to be parent and child and be nurturing and supportive. So focus on maintaining the old things. And then note things that are problematic and communicate that to the person who's providing instruction, whether it's communicating because you want guidance on how to address it yourself, or whether it's communicating like, hey, are you aware of? But that would be the best thing to, again, make it a task that you are both enjoying and it's not something you're fighting each over. each other overdoing every day.
That's really great advice. So, Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time out to help us parents understand this better. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful having a chance to talk with you.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, share it with a friend and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You can also follow us on social media for more helpful tips and resources at Dyslexia Made Clear.